September 14th, 2007. A queue of over 100 people stretches round the corner of the Brighton branch of Northern Rock Bank, Britain's fifth biggest mortgage lender. Just hours earlier, the bank had issued a grave warning. After years of risky borrowing, they were in real risk of running out of cash. What happened next came to define the next few decades. Crowds grew at branches across the country as more and more desperate customers rushed to get their money before it was too late. But by that evening, time was up. Northern Rock had run dry, marking Britain's first bank run in 150 years. Within a few months, they were absorbed by the government, never to be seen again. And while this moment may have faded into history, the effects on the UK's economy are impossible to ignore. Since 2008, Britain's economy has never recovered. It's tried austerity, tax cuts, even leaving the European Union, but nothing has worked. If the UK had continued to carry on the same trend as before the crisis, average real incomes across Britain would be £52,000, 31% higher than they are today. But instead, year after year, Prime Minister after Prime Minister, Britain has fallen further and further behind its peers. So what went wrong? What happened on that day in 2007 that hit Britain harder than any other country? And more importantly, can it ever recover? Okay, so it's not exactly a secret that the 2008 crisis hit the global economy pretty bad. It bankrupted one of America's oldest banks, set off a debt crisis across Europe, and even single-handedly collapsed the entire economy of Iceland. But in pretty much every single one of these cases, the countries have bounced back, except in the UK. And to understand why, you have to go back to the 1980s and one infamous British leader, Margaret Thatcher. At the time, Britain's economy was just coming out of one of its worst ever decades economically, and Thatcher had already made a number of big decisions to fix this. She boosted interest rates, cut money supply, and most importantly, brought inflation under control. And after a few years, she was making some real progress. And by the mid-1980s, she was ready to go one step further and turn Britain into a global financial superpower. In 1986, Thatcher introduced the now infamous Big Bang deregulation package. She basically ripped up the rulebook, making it cheaper, easier, and faster for anyone in the world to come and do business in London. And on the surface, it worked. International banks poured £450 million into the city, and 1,500 new millionaires were minted. In the roughly 10 years that Thatcher was in charge, Britain's overall economy grew by 40%, from £1 trillion to £1.4 trillion. Now, this is objectively a very impressive thing, and the results spoke for themselves. Between 1980 and 2008, Britain went from being the sick man of Europe to one of its most successful large economies. By 2005, the UK had nearly caught up with Germany on GDP per capita and was pulling well ahead of France and Italy. And this wasn't just a Thatcher thing either. Blair and Brown both came in and kept the model going. However, beneath all of this was a problem. Most of that growth was being captured by a small group of people, primarily in London and at the expense of the rest of the country. And while finance was booming, many of the industries that the UK had relied upon in the past were being gutted. Manufacturing collapsed from 30% of GDP to just 16%, taking millions of indirect jobs with it, and heavy industry was exactly the same. However, Britain ploughed on. London was simply making too much money. By 2007, financial services accounted for around 9% of UK GDP and roughly 12% of all tax receipts, with the government effectively funding public services off the back of city profits and bonuses. From 1992 onward, Britain enjoyed its longest stretch of economic growth since the Second World War. And this period in particular is looked back upon with nostalgia by many British people, as bands like Oasis and Blur were worldwide hits, and the Cool Britannia movement swept the country. But by the mid-2000s, this period of optimism was coming to an end, and in 2008, the bubble burst, taking the UK and the rest of the world down with it. But while other economies have bounced back, Britain has remained completely stagnant. Broadly speaking, the UK economy has one key issue. It has forgotten how to do anything. It's worth going back to this chart here, as it perfectly captures the current situation the UK is in. This massive gap between the UK and other countries is primarily driven by one thing: Productivity. Since 2008, UK labour productivity has grown by just 4%. In the United States, this is 18%. So, what happened? Productivity is basically just a measure of how much you get done with what you've got. If you've got two coffee shops that both have 5 staff, and one serves twice as many customers, that shop is more productive. And the reason is usually pretty simple. It could be that it has better equipment, a better layout, or better systems. In other words, it's had more investment. Someone spent money making that shop work better. And that's the thing that Britain has stopped doing. In 2024, the average person was working 4.4% more than in 2019, but producing less. And a big part of the reason goes back to what happened right after the crash. Back then, the UK's public spending had ballooned, and debt was becoming a real problem. And the new government, led by David Cameron and George Osborne's answer was cuts, and lots of them. This meant less spending on things that actually grow the economy. Things like infrastructure, skills, research and development, things that private firms would need to expand and modernise. Now, the UK was already chronically underinvesting before the crisis, and this was made even worse with austerity. But it somehow got even worse than that just 6 years later. In a narrow 52-48 vote, Britain decided to leave the European Union and its customs union. Now, this is still a hotly debated topic to this day, but by most estimates, this has been devastating. GDP has fallen by an estimated 6 to 8%, while the average Brit is roughly £3,000 poorer than they were before. And since then, investment, which remember was already lower than other peers, has fallen off a cliff. The uncomfortable truth is that Britain has become an awful place to invest your money. It's an amazing place to hide and clean your money, sure, but an awful place to invest it. But why? What is it about Britain that makes it such a bad bet? Because it's not like the country doesn't have the raw ingredients. It's got world-class universities, a strong legal system, the English language, and a well-educated population. On paper, the UK should be one of the best places in the world to build a business. The answer is frustratingly simple. Britain just doesn't let you do anything. In the last 5 years, the UK has had a string of different leaders, each with their own unique vision for the country. Boris was going to level up the nation. Liz Truss was going to turn us into a low-tax Singapore on Thames. And Keir Starmer's mission was all about growth. However, none of these grand visions really matter unless the UK fixes a very basic set of problems which have been quietly strangling the economy for decades. And the first is one we've become all too familiar with: housing. To put it simply, the UK has a severe housing shortage. Britain and France have roughly the same amount of people, and yet France has 7 million more homes. And nowhere is this more apparent than in London. London wages are 14% higher than the rest of the country, but when you account for the inflated cost of living from housing, this advantage drops to just 1%. In fact, London is one of the only major cities where more British people actively leave it every year rather than moving toward it. And the main reason for this is really simple: there aren't enough houses. At the start of his government, Keir Starmer announced a bold plan to fix Britain's housing crisis, promising to build 1.5 million houses in the next 5 years, roughly 300,000 per year. However, 2 years into this government, and the picture is sobering. In the first year of his premiership, Starmer only delivered 208,000 new homes, which was actually 6% fewer than the previous year, and the lowest figure in 8 years. And in the first quarter of 2026, only 32,000 homes were completed, less than half of the 75,000 which would be needed to hit the target. And while it's easy to point fingers at Starmer, the reason for this crisis goes back decades. Right after the Second World War, Clement Attlee's government basically drew rings around every major city in the country and said you can't build beyond this point. These greenbelts were supposed to protect the countryside, which is valid, but they've also put a hard cap on how much Britain's most productive cities can grow. The UK now has a shortfall of around 4.3 million homes compared to the rest of Western Europe, and 2/3 of the land identified for potential housing near major cities is ruled out by greenbelt restrictions. And even if you built on every single brownfield site in the country, it still wouldn't be enough to hit that 300,000 a year target. This is a problem which has gotten worse over time. Back in 1947, when these rules were invented, it didn't matter as much where you lived, and you could get a decent job in your local area. But as the UK has grown, economic opportunities have become more and more clustered in major cities. It's the exact reason tech companies still pay insane rents to be in Silicon Valley, because that's where all the talent and capital are. But Britain's planning system prevents exactly that kind of clustering from happening, and so the most productive areas cannot physically expand. However, even when houses are built in these major economic centres, actually getting hold of one is another story. In the first quarter of 2024, roughly 27% of all residential property sales in London went to foreign buyers. To put that into perspective, in New York, that very same figure was 0.3%, and now 20% of new rental properties in London now have at least one foreign shareholder, double what it was in 2016. Britain has become a world-class place to park your wealth, but an increasingly difficult place for actual British people to find somewhere to live. Across the UK, the affordable stock has been sold off and never replaced, and ended up back on the market at prices most people can't afford. And this feeds directly into why the economy can't recover from 2008. If you try and move from the north to London for a better paying job, housing costs eat up almost all of the salary gain, so people just don't bother, and labour gets trapped in all the wrong places. The most productive cities can't expand, and productivity stagnates. But even if Britain could build enough homes, it would run into another problem pretty quickly, because building anything, houses, factories, even AI data centres, requires energy, and Britain's energy situation has become just as broken. As basic as it seems, energy is the fundamental bedrock of all economic activity. It is impossible to produce goods, transport materials, or run services without it. There's a reason that energy consumption per capita is one of the strongest things that correlates with national incomes across the world. The more productive a country is, the more energy it uses, and affordable, stable energy costs are essential to growth. For decades, Britain understood this better than almost anyone else. Across its modern history, the UK was able to source and produce cheap energy. And in the late 1970s, North Sea oil turned Britain into one of the world's major petroleum economies almost overnight. And this peaked in 1999. In fact, we actually made a whole video about how Britain made one of its biggest errors, squandering the opportunity, which you can watch somewhere up here. But the point is that energy production in the UK has gone from a major strength to a major weakness. Per capita electricity generation in the UK is just 2/3 of what it is in France, and barely 1/3 of what it is in the United States. In fact, Britain is closer to developing countries like Brazil and South Africa in terms of per capita electricity output than it is to Germany, Japan, or Canada. In the early 2000s, the UK shifted from being a net exporter to a net importer of energy, and the results have been hard to miss. These prices were already on the rise before the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, but now they're impossible to ignore. Britain now has some of the highest domestic and industrial energy prices amongst developed nations, which is absolutely crippling the economy, essentially acting as a tax on every single thing the country produces. And it's not like any of this was inevitable either. A proven model of cheap energy has literally been across the channel this entire time. France generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, thanks to an aggressive rollout that began in the 1970s. And nuclear doesn't suffer from the same intermittency problems that wind and solar face, meaning you need more expensive storage and backup fossil fuel generations, which drives up costs significantly. The result for them is abundant, cheap, and low carbon energy, which Britain had every opportunity to do so and simply chose not to. So, businesses are already paying more for energy than almost any other developed country. And you'd think that if everything else was stacked against you, the government would at least make it worth your while to try. But instead, Britain has done the opposite. Since 2008, the UK tax burden has risen almost continuously, and it's now at the highest level since the 1940s. However, it's the way that Britain taxes that's even more damaging than how much it taxes. In the US, in order to hit the top marginal income tax rate, you'd need to be earning 8.5 times the average wage. In the UK, it's just 3.5 times, making it not just a tax on the rich, but on anyone who's doing reasonably well. Senior teachers, mid-career engineers, and small business owners, essentially anyone aspirational. The UK is also aging faster than the US, and the people who respond most to these tax increases are older workers, as they could simply just retire. So Britain is simultaneously facing a demographic crunch where it desperately needs people to stay in the workforce, while taxing them to the point that there isn't much reason to do so. This is all made worse when you consider where this money is actually being spent. Since the pandemic, spending on sickness benefits have nearly doubled, rising to over £50 billion a year. The simple fact is, if that Britain wants to have a large welfare state, it needs an extremely capitalist private economy to pay for it. The result of all of this is that a huge number of young productive people are starting to leave the country, going to Australia, Dubai, Singapore, basically anywhere that doesn't punish them for doing well. So, what can the UK actually do about this? In May 2026, Tony Blair, the former leader of the UK for 10 years, published an essay detailing what he thought the issue with Britain was. Blair's central argument is that Britain's problem isn't personality, communication, or even specific policies. It's the absence of any coherent strategy for a fast-changing world, and despite all the negativity, there are a couple of real growth areas for the UK. The result of that is that even the areas where the UK should have a real shot for generating economic growth often end up failing to do so. Artificial intelligence is about to reshape the global economy in ways in which we can't probably fully comprehend yet, and Britain, almost despite itself, is actually well positioned for this. DeepMind, arguably the most important AI research lab in the world, is based in London. The UK has 4 of the world's top 10 universities, and has Europe's largest tech ecosystem and a time zone that bridges America and Asian markets. The problem is, AI needs a huge amount of cheap energy to function, something which the UK doesn't have. And even if the country wanted to massively invest in developing new energy sources like solar or nuclear, the planning system would make this practically impossible. Without fixing the basics, leveraging technology like AI becomes practically impossible, regardless of how good a country's universities are. To have any chance of fixing this, it would require a load of major reforms to lots of different things at once: planning, capital markets, infrastructure investment, tax rates. But the problem that Blair outlined in his essay is that, well, nobody seems that interested in trying to do this. If Keir Starmer is replaced in the next few months, the country will move on to its 7th Prime Minister in just 10 years. With leaders holding office for such a short amount of time, they never really have the chance to develop an actual plan for how to change the country, much less implement it. Rather than making the hard choices that are sometimes needed, successive governments have just kind of muddled through, hoping the problem would resolve itself. The cruel irony is that Britain actually knows what it needs to do. There's a pretty broad consensus as to what needs to happen across most sides of the political spectrum. Actually being able to get those things done, though, is another question altogether. Okay, on a bit of a separate note, on May 31st, President Trump posted "Time to audit Fort Knox," the most direct signal yet that sovereign hard assets are back at the centre of the global conversation. And yet, gold has fallen for 3 consecutive months since hitting all-time highs in Q1. Gold stock indices are actually in the red for this year, and investors who were piling in at the peak are now quietly closing positions. But this is exactly why you should be paying attention. Warren Buffett's most famous rule was be careful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are careful. The president is auditing Fort Knox. The ECB has just announced that gold has surpassed treasuries as the most held reserve asset by central banks. The macro case has never been stronger, and yet the sentiment has never been more bearish. The sponsor of today's video is Canadian Goldfields Discovery, ticker symbol CGMXF, which you can find on Fidelity, Schwab, Interactive Brokers, and ET Trade. Around 30% is held by institutions, and another 30% by management and insiders, which is 60% of the company in the hands of people with real skin in the game, and a drill program that's imminent. The management team has come through K92 Mining, BHP, and Ivanhoe Mines. A current director at Canadian Goldfields is VP at K92, which is one of the most successful junior to producer stories of the last 20 years. Canadian Goldfields has already acquired 2 gold assets in 2026, with drilling on the flagship Miminska project scheduled for the second half of this year. But here's the macro context that makes this timing interesting. The SpaceX, Anthropic, and OpenAI IPOs are projected to raise as much capital as more than 300 internet and technology IPOs combined in the year 2000. The Nasdaq peaked in March 2000, then lost 78% over the next 2 years. What followed was a decade-long bull market in gold, from $250 an ounce in 2001 to $1,900 by 2011. The capital that fled digital speculation found its home in physical reality. Now look at where Canadian Goldfields is operating. Northwestern Ontario is one of the most productive gold-producing regions in North American history. Timmins, the city with a heart of gold, home to the Hollinger-McIntyre mine, one of the greatest gold mines ever, Kirkland Lake, where the mile of gold produced over 700 metric tons, and Musselwhite, with over 6 million ounces in the late 1990s, sitting in the same greenstone belt that hosts Canadian Goldfields' own projects. 2 high-grade zones have already been confirmed, the Miminska zone to the southwest and the Frond zone to the northeast. Between them sits 12 kilometers of largely undrilled corridor, never touched with modern technology, and that's what the drill program is targeting. The previous work on this ground was shallow, narrow, and episodic. What's coming is coordinated, comprehensive, and sequenced to maximize discovery potential. As always, do your own independent research, but if you're looking for a contrarian entry point in a sector where sentiment is at its lowest and macro tailwinds are building, this is one worth a closer look.